Welcome, attendees, to Designing a Better UX for Regulated Industries in the Digital Age. We're going to get started probably in a couple minutes. It usually takes some time for folks to, get out of their last meeting, get a glass of water, come into the meeting, and it takes a little bit for Zoom to catch up. But my name is Phil Sharon, and I'm going to be introducing the panel today. So as you are all joining, you want to orient yourselves a little bit to the to what you're looking at here. First of all, I'm going to launch a poll, and you should be seeing a poll now as you enter, and we're just curious what kinds of topics brought you here. It will help our panel focus what their conversation is on. So if you have a few moments to answer that poll, that would be really helpful. A couple other notes about the event. Again, this is a panel session with some Think Company experts who work in regulated industries. So we're asking you to answer a poll to help us focus the conversation a little bit. We're really excited actually about another feature within Zoom webinars that we have this year that we didn't have last year from an accessibility standpoint. There's a closed captioning feature. So if there's anybody who needs transcription and closed captioning, and you can go down to the CC logo at the bottom of your screen and turn that on. And you'll be able to see a transcript of what folks are talking about. It's being done mechanically. It's not being done by an actual human translator. So there might be a few glitches in it, but it's better than nothing. So for those of you just joining, we're taking a few minutes. We'll probably start, I would say, at about 3:02 or 3:03, just to make sure that we're getting a critical mass of folks. In the meantime, if you want to say hi, you're welcome to open up chat and introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from. You can even mention in there what sort of topics you're interested in hearing, sort of following up on the poll information that you're filling out. So it'd be great to hear where you're from. I am sitting in the beautiful Think Company offices in Center City, Philadelphia, or around 13th and Walnut Street. But yeah, if anybody wants to let us know in chat where you're from, that would be great. Great to hear and see about you. I see a lot of names that I recognize. We got people from Wilmington. We've got someone checking in from Philadelphia. So far, Wilmington is the furthest distance we have. South Philly. We've had people actually in past webinars as far away. We had someone from Egypt check in once. More Philly folks. Someone from Oslo. Awesome. That's great to hear. More folks from Philly. California, South Philly, someone right next to the Bach building. That's a great place. North Wales, PA. Awesome. Let's let it go. I guess we're getting around to 3 after. So why don't we get started? Folks are probably going to be coming in as we move along. So let me move to the next screen. We can get rid of that little drum beat there. And for those of you who are still checking in, don't forget to fill out the poll just so we can focus the conversation a little bit. But in the meantime, I will go ahead and we'll start to introduce what's going on here. So for those of you who haven't heard of us before, we are Think Company. We're an experience design and technology consultancy located physically. We're located in Philadelphia. We have offices in Philadelphia. We actually have thinkers all around the United States, especially after the pandemic. There's about 125 of us, and we're all experts at researching, designing, developing, and managing digital products that are not only beautiful, but they also focus on what people need to get their jobs done. And we make sure that they're easy to use as well. So we help our clients achieve their business goals by improving digital experiences for not only their customers, but also their employees. It's a little bit about Think Company. Just to let you know, in this current environment, we've seen how important digital experiences are for business continuity. We help our clients create world-class digital experiences. So if you're involved in helping your organizations build or improve something with that goal in mind, let's talk. You can find our contact info at thinkcompany.com or follow this URL and ask to start a conversation with our experts at any time. So a lot of this information will also be shared at the end. We'll send it out with the recording to the mailing list of the people who have signed up. So if you can't type in this URL fast, it'll be sent along later on with information. Just to introduce our panel, who will be joining us in a couple of seconds, Colleen Reese is a principal content strategist here at Think Company. She has more than 12 years of experience leading content design efforts in e-commerce, higher education, pharmaceuticals, and food and beverage. Colleen specializes in highly structured content environments and believes in leveraging rapid, small-scale problem solving to facilitate transformative changes in enterprise environments. John Young is our Director of Technology. He's been writing code and leading teams of developers since 1999. Since joining Think Company in 2017, John's led projects for Comcast, Merck, and other pharmaceutical, media, and financial services industry clients. He firmly believes that the best predictor of success on a project is how well the team communicates and whether they have the right tools and information to do their jobs. We also have Keith Rich, who's a principal experience designer at Think Company. He has a passion for designing research-driven prototypes to help craft optimal experiences for clients and their users. He's worked with teams in various industries such as pharmaceuticals, finance, beverage, distribution, and telecommunications. He thrives in the space between product design and engineering, where he collaborates with his peers across disciplines to build valuable and beneficial experiences for the people who need them. And finally, but not last, last but not least, is Sungkwan Bush. He's a design lead here at Think Company. He's an aspiring generalist. Sungkwan has worked on complex enterprise applications spanning a broad spectrum of industries. Through his experience, he's used to navigating design and research constraints in highly regulated industries to find the best path forward for his clients. I have the privilege of working with these folks every single day, and I have to say it is quite a joy and quite a learning experience to be working with them, be able to experience their expertise. So really quickly, just a few ground rules for this event. Just so you all know, you're muted by default. We're using Zoom's auto-generated live captioning feature, so you can turn on your CC settings via your control panel. Live Q&A will start around 3:45. We can go as long as 4:15 if folks want to stay. Please post questions within the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be monitoring Q&A and choose questions for the Q&A session at the end. If you upvote questions, I'll choose the questions that are brought to the surface more quickly. So even if you don't have a question, keep monitoring the Q&A channel and upvote those questions that are things that you want to hear answers to in the end. If we select your question, I will unmute you and introduce you to ask your question. If you want to be anonymous or don't feel like hearing your voice over the webinar, then just use the anonymous feature to post your question anonymously, and I'll ask the question for you. We may not be able to get to all the questions depending on time, and we do have moderators who are in chat and Q&A, so feel free to engage with us over there. If you have any issues with the webinar, go into chat, and if you have any issues or if you want to post questions, please post your questions in Q&A. It's really difficult to moderate questions in the chat feature. So without any further ado, I'm going to open it up to John Young, who's going to give us a quick kickoff, talk about regulated industries. And at some point during John's talk, I will close the poll. So make sure you finish it now, and the team will be using the results of that poll in order to focus the conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And if all of our panelists will join us, welcome everyone. I'm going to go into hiding, and John, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to take 5 minutes and I'm going to talk to the one person that might or might not be in this room today. I've looked at the panelists, I've looked at the attendees, and what I see are a lot of folks that are in the trenches, working in regulated environments, in financial services, in pharma, in learning. But just in case there's anybody here that's like, help, I've just accepted a job in a regulated environment and I start on Monday. What do I want to expect? I'm just going to do some quick level setting for that person. And I'm going to talk about things that I bet most of the, or possibly all of the people know here already. The first chapter of my career was agency work, straightforward microsite builds. As long as a sufficiently awesome EVP approved it to go live, it went live. We occasionally had to think about what you can or couldn't do on the internet, but very rarely, because there was not much. There was no regulation at that time. The second phase of my career was in publishing. I'm a technologist. At every day at 9 a.m., the editor-in-chief and the House counsel would sit down with all the writers in publishing, and they decide, what can we say on the cover of the magazine? What can't we say on the cover of the magazine? Will this giant A-list celebrity try and sue us if we say that? If they try and sue us, will we go ahead and say it anyway? And the House counsel will get a very far away look in their eyes. And eventually they would either say, yes, print it, or no, we can't do it. And if they couldn't do it, it would get spiked right then and there. That doesn't count as a regulated environment because there's no regulations. There's just a couple of people that you have daily contact with that have all the say so. So we didn't really need process for that. The process is really just have enough stuff to pitch your stories and figure it out. In the pharma, in the finance and other spaces, things are very different from the early days of the internet, where you knew who your stakeholders were, you could generally predict what they were going to say, and you had sufficient access to them that you didn't have to really worry too much about preparing. All of us now have been dealing with content regulatory committees or other kinds of committees that are answering questions like, yes, you can say that, but you can't say that to this person. Yes, you can say that, but you have to say it in a smaller font type than you're talking about. Yes, you can say that, but you can't say that to someone who's coming from this country. Yes, you can say that to a pharmacist, but you can only say that to a pharmacist who has an NAIC number instead of somebody else. And you don't have access to that person all the time. You don't have access to those committees all the time. You've got to find ways to streamline the collaboration with and find ways to collaborate with those folks so that instead of a contentious process of knocking together, instead of taking your heart into your mouth every time you go into a CRC review meeting, because the next 3 weeks of your job are either going to be significantly better or significantly worse, depending on what these folks might say. You can put things together so that your job is more smooth, it is more predictable, and that you will be able to get the results that you're looking for, even though you won't be able to control them. One final thing, when we are talking about being in a regulated environment, we're not necessarily talking about the overarching frameworks like, for instance, GDPR or like COPA or like CAN-SPAM that are generally speaking well understood and have slow rates of change. As a technologist, the things that you need to comply with those frameworks, those go into your website build as requirements. And as long as you satisfy them, and as long as things don't change, you're generally okay. When we're talking about regulatory environments, we're talking about that bread and butter, day-to-day, working with and collaborating with the subject matter experts who say whether or not this thing can be said looking like this to this particular person who is authenticated in this particular way, and to make that smoother and more predictable. So that's it for sort of the setup. And so I'd like to pass off to Keith Rich to talk about the next thing.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Thanks, Phil. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We really were taking a look at the poll from earlier. And as Phil mentioned, we wanted that to really drive the conversation and what we kind of will touch on most. So as John mentioned, the collaboration is a big part of designing better UX in the regulated industries. And so I think the first thing we really want to talk about is that collaboration. And I'll direct kind of the first question to Sungkwan. And when we're talking about that relationship between design, which can be more exploratory and kind of thinking about all the possible solutions, and then thinking about also those meetings where we have to go into regulatory meetings or reviews that are more controlled and more definitive, I think that's where it requires some care and consideration in order to make that relationship flourish. And so, Sungkwan, just wanted to see from your experience, what are some of those effective ways that you've kind of bridged the gap between design and regulatory in those review meetings?
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, so in my working in pharma, which has been about 4.5 years at this point, I've kind of seen an evolution, at least within the organization that I've consulted for, where it started out very adversarial. They were pretty much, and I'm sure some of you might cringe or relate to this, lawyers literally taking a ruler, measuring line distance between fonts, trying to double check that your InDesign file actually has the exact same font size and you're not trying to sneak anything in. So it was an extremely sort of distrustful adversarial environment where the legal teams never trusted the agencies. The agencies thought, well, we're just going to get away with whatever we can because we don't have any time anyway, and we just need them to approve this thing. So, but that same company managed to take steps over time that allowed for a lot more cooperation. And part of that was through having a lot of user interviews and stakeholder conversations with various parties from both the design teams and from legal, and starting to realize that a lot of times, it's not like the agencies want to break the law or anything like that, but it's just like they might see, hey, I just, this shouldn't be such a big deal. I just need to get this out. You're maybe the most strict. Like, I just don't have a whole lot of time to. I don't trust actually going to, face to make sure everything's well designed. Then legal can often just approach everything with a very fine-tooth comb. So there was just that fundamental level of, do we trust that both parties are trying to make sure that this design goes through? And a lot of times, like, that broke down because there was so little time for lawyers to really get in to talk about or talk through the nuances with the team. And the places where I've seen most success were basically where, it had to start also from even at that scoping level. Like, did we actually bring in lawyers? Do we have enough time allocated for the legal team, from somebody at the top, at an executive level, saying, we're going to make sure that you have an hour with this panel of legal team members, every month or something like that, which is easier said than done when, we're very, it's a very specialized set of knowledge and there's tons of stuff that has to be reviewed. But I know for that, that's kind of when things start to get better, is when you have more face time, you have more ability to understand the nuances of what your legal team is, seeking to do to kind of address those regulatory issues, and can explore and work through solutions. But yeah, it's still definitely not easy for sure.
Right. I bet even more impacted by the pandemic and being remote. I think that time even decreases more and more with that as well. So I know also from a perspective of content, and Colleen, the work that you've done over the years, I think you have a few tips and tricks as well, or just some effective ways of working with regulatory teams.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced a lot of the same kind of evolution of how we work with regulations and regulatory boards in the environments that I've worked in. And, pretty often when we're talking about large scale content and design transformations, they're typically a vehicle for organizational change, either because the thing that you're creating is going to affect the way that the organization operates, or because someone is trying to usher in organizational change. And one of the ways that they can possibly do that is through content and digital transformations. And so the job of design and UX and content has always been a lot more than the thing that we are actively designing for. And it's a lot around building advocacy around this organizational shift that we're trying to create. And so there are a lot of pre-steps, from that final stage or final concepts, where we can start to engage regulatory teams earlier and more often in the process of content and in the process of design. And it's an investment for sure, and it has to be something where you are advocating for those resources for your team. But even as we look at, kind of the way that work gets done now, a lot of teams are adopting agile methodologies, and there's greater emphasis around decision making in lower fidelity deliverables and activities. And so looking for opportunities to engage with the review teams or the people who make decisions about compliance within your organization prior to even starting something like design is definitely kind of the way to go.
Awesome. John, anything to add from the tech perspective? I know we've all kind of worked on various projects across different industries, but
well, you see me nodding my head off as both Sunquan and Colleen are talking, because the key is getting them involved earlier, because if you've done all the work and it's about to go into development, and now you've got it's like, okay, great, we have two possibilities. One is 5 stars, everything's perfect, The other option is giant emergency, everyone's staying after hours to, put things back together. Like, you've lost already. That's a no-win situation. And I'm thinking through, like, and so yes, collaborate earlier and more often with extraordinarily busy, over-allocated people who are working on your project and a dozen others just like it. What are some things that we've seen where you can get regulatory involved earlier? Either by, I'll stop there. Like, thoughts about, like, yeah, how do you get there?
One word comes to mind, and that is async, which has grown more and more in the pandemic. And so one tool, for example, that has been used is called Loom, but it can also be any other technology that basically records you walking through a user flow or any design that you would normally kind of present in person in a meeting. You can pre-record that and send it along. That way there's no meeting, the schedules don't have to sync up together, but you can still get that message across and hopefully get some feedback in that way. I know we've done that on various projects and had some success with it, but that's just one way to do it. When the calendars don't align, it's always about figuring out, how to do that on someone else's time when they can do it.
Yeah, I like that, because also we're talking about low fidelity review versus high fidelity review. And sometimes I always think that low fidelity review is a great first step, but sometimes it seems like people are real allergic to reacting to anything low fidelity. And Loom is nice, I feel like, sometimes for those folks that are just like, just show me what you're going to launch, And so, like, well, if you have a sufficiently high fidelity prototype, and you know how to do a happy path in InVision and with Loom, you can kind of get there and give that person the feeling of reacting to something very high fidelity without necessarily having to get all the way to build. And I'm curious if Colleen and Sungkwan, you have other, carrot versus stick ideas for getting regulatory to react sooner.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, even pre-prototype is the best time to start talking to people about requirements and even just about objectives. Especially if you have if you're working in an environment where research is highly prioritized, or that you're conducting a lot of direct user research, there's going to be regulation around who you can talk to and how you can talk to them. And so, as early as a kickoff, to get somebody in a kickoff meeting for 5 minutes to talk about even the process that you're thinking about going for, and look for pitfalls, understand, maybe hidden requirements in the way that you're kind of planning your project. And I think, like, I default a lot to process in highly regulated environments, because it's kind of a language that everyone agrees to. And so it's a way to kind of set a way to communicate with each other without having anything of substance to really talk about yet.
Yeah, I would definitely have to echo, the process aspect, where, for me, that, oftentimes the boring answer is that the best recipe is having enough time in the room often enough, right? Because that's the way that, I'm, currently working on an immensely complex portal that works with a lot of different, decision makers and formulary, like all sorts of different stakeholders. And since it spans a lot of different products, you need a lot of different legal reviewers to be involved. And it pretty much would have been impossible if we didn't manage to get executive sponsorship to say, hey, you've got an hour with these 4 lawyers, because sometimes it's hard enough to even get 1 or 2 in the room for 30 minutes, right? Or 15 minutes. And, that's really a huge help, is having time to say, hey, last month we looked at a couple of these things. And as you know, like, we were able to start with wireframes, talk through things at a relatively early level because we had time to get them up to speed. And it wasn't like we had to somehow get them up to speed in 30, and also run through the designs all within a teeny tiny amount of time. And it seems like, from observation, organizations that build in that kind of time or build in a dedicated set of team members that can focus on providing that legal perspective early and often seems like it's been the thing that's worked out the most for us, or at least for my team.
Yeah. I love where we're going with this, because we're talking about kind of the next topic here when we talk about process and structure. So not only, at the operational level, but also tactically on the products that we're going to be producing. And so I want to direct this question to you, Colleen, specifically. And this is kind of talking about that, designing with the system in mind, whether that's, visual or content, and doing that to kind of help set up a lot of that usually surprises that happen at the end. So if we kind of go in knowing, what we're working with, what are those Legos that are in the box, we kind of have a little bit of a confinement in there. So kind of just knowing that that's more or less standard these days, kind of having some kind of structure or system in place when you're designing. But I think the question really is like, what are the major benefits of having a systemic approach to your design and your content modeling? How does that kind of help, whether it's collaboration, but also efficiency for designers and practitioners?
Yeah, the obvious benefit for having certain elements of content and design systematized is to reduce the amount of time and energy that's spent on things that we know are set by either requirements from regulatory or just our own requirements from like a best practices standpoint. And to almost kind of make a promise to the partners that we have in regulation. So if we can commit to making sure that really small things like font sizes are built into our design systems, or we use controlled vocabularies to determine how certain things are spoken about, and even create different models for certain types of content or certain components of content. This allows both the designer and whoever is in kind of this reviewer role to focus more on the substance of things that require a little bit more variability or are just a bit more complex. And so the more that we can lay the foundations for things that are immutable, the better.
Yeah, I've noticed that on a few projects I've been on too, of having that kind of trust, but also like the confidence in knowing that we're going down a path where everyone's kind of bought in, speaking that same language at the outset. And then, yeah, again, there's less surprise, less variability, as you mentioned, later on in the process there.
Yeah, and like John mentioned, like I think we're all a bit resource constrained, and there are very busy people that we're trying to work with who are working with a lot of other people on a lot of different objectives. And so when we can make good on the things that we've systematized, there's also plenty of content and design out there that doesn't need a systems-based approach, and that needs a little bit more time and energy. And so providing additional, like not taking up all of those resources and allowing space for things that might be a little bit more experimental in nature or are more temporary in nature is going to let both teams kind of focus on the things that are in front of them while we kind of manage the product at a different level.
John, I feel like you had something to say there.
Well, this is, and Keith, this is what I've seen you do. As Think continues to use, we just published a blog post on our use of Figma, and how we just took a Fortune 100 company to, into Figma, and we've been loving it. But that isn't intended to be like a tool thing, like Figma is the best. It's the way that you were using Figma. Keith put together a foundational Figma file with foundational items, colors, fontography, spacing, components. And then the nice thing about that is that's not only used by us at Think in order to keep things that have already been decided, but also then that is shared across agencies. So if you've got 45 agencies building 45 microsites, just to be able to hand them a box of Legos saying, here you go, As long as anything you snap together using this is already almost or completely approved. And I'll talk, Colleen, I'm going to want you to talk about smart templates and their possibilities in just a moment, because some of that stuff. But again, the idea is that if you can share answered questions across organizations, that's going to be fantastic, because how many folks like, hey, here, make a microsite, and then they come back with a microsite and be like, okay, first of all, we got to talk about those H1s. Like, no, when you've got the design system and you can share the foundational stuff that's already been approved, that reduces the scope to, Colleen, just as you were saying, like, well, let's talk about the content that may or may not be done. And so, Colleen, I was wondering, like, you had talked in a conversation we were having previously about some of the ideas of how a system can embed some of that intelligence. Do you feel like now is a good time to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think a design system will do, quite a lot of the heavy lifting for that. And then we ask things like our CMS and CRMs to kind of ingest that information. And if we can lift content and design production kind of away from legacy models where you're kind of building something wholesale, and more into models where they are potentially even designing within a CMS or a CRM or an LMS, whatever it is that you're using. We're just reducing a lot of churn around really like the minutia of how something gets designed. And so if there are requirements about balance and visual prominence of things, we can kind of automate those considerations by way of a comprehensive design system, and then some type of content management system that works with it.
Yeah, just building on that, I think it definitely touches back on the idea that something like a design system is a vehicle for legal to have some level of trust, right? Or like, it's sort of like serves as a fiat sort of design language where they say like, no, I'm not going to measure each headline, but because I know that, our legal board already approved this design system, it's not like a design system is a silver bullet. There are always going to be nuanced questions about what content's allowed here, what audience is allowed to see this, how are we supposed to show, in pharma, it's often these two drugs together, even if they're in different approval statuses by the FDA, and all sorts of questions that'll come up. But at least you have the fundamentals out of the way and are not being bogged down by, font size, minutia, colors, icons as much, because those have been pre-decided. And wherever you can find those precedents, or, especially if you're new to the organization, digging for, what's legal already approved in the past, what kinds of designs have they done, any of that will help to just build that base of trust and saying, hey, this is how we did things before, can we start here and move on from there?
Yeah, Sungkwan, could you talk a little bit more about like the portal idea? So multiple brands kind of living under one umbrella. You mentioned the other day kind of like, oh, well, there's different reviews for different, brands and different partners. So how do you kind of deal with that when it's all under one umbrella?
Yeah, and so that is another example where oftentimes, in pharma, for example, it can be very siloed by brand, where each brand has its own marketing team that's really hyper focused on making sure that promotional content for that brand is churning out at a at a reasonable pace. And sometimes those brands have unique rules that they're dealing with, like if this drug is important enough that the FDA is giving you kind of a pre-approved time to have this thing out or have it used in a new way. Like COVID-19 times is a perfect example when, as you've seen, like the FDA tends to let certain high priority drugs kind of move forward before they've gotten fully stamped or approved. And that sort of in-between period could last 4 to 5 years, depending on how long the clinical trials are running. And what'll usually happen is that those types of brands tend to have extra reviews. It's something where like with a lot of, at least in the pharma world where I'm familiar, the FDA may not literally go and click on every single pharma website to make sure every page is compliant, but because those are sort of a special case, hey, this hasn't been fully approved yet, but we're using it in a special way, it's sort of like the FDA will, somebody in the FDA will literally check every single document that you submit of this particular page. And so that's where, normally where legal, teams might say, well, this is fine, or like, okay, I'm not going to check every line. That's often sort of a flag to be like, okay, now I'm going to check every line. Now you need to submit every version of this, notification feed, for example, where this drug might appear, including when it doesn't appear, and it can start to get pretty heavy. So that's another one of those things where talking early and often, even things like talking to legal about, the brands you want to bring in is often, that's something where, I had that snag on my team, but we were able to anticipate it and work on it early and find the right people to ask about how they do things when it comes to how they submit documents, and that all avoided what would have been a really big snag that could have pretty much shut the whole thing down if we didn't catch that early enough. So
yeah, we talked about time a lot as being kind of a blocker to a lot of the collaboration and cohesion. I wonder if there are any other kind of blockers that people have come up against as far as getting regulatory and design teams to kind of collaborate earlier besides time, because we all know that that's a limited resource. But yeah, just curious, opening up to everyone on the panel.
I could chime in one real quick with one thing I've seen more like, as a consultant, I don't have as much visibility directly into organizations, but I know that the stakeholders I've seen that have had the most success are the ones that do the hard work of having, building rapport, get to know some of the lawyers on the team, like have lunch with them. It's a lot of that sort of back channel wheel greasing that's become way harder to do in COVID, but is ever so much more important. Because I've seen where, that stakeholder that had a good relationship with the lawyer, that lawyer left the organization, suddenly nothing gets done. So, however way you're able to do that, I found that tends to help with, building some basis of trust, and then also often some possibility of, hey, let's talk to your boss's boss. Let's get some more legal review time for this particular product that we're working on. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, we do have one more topic we wanted to hit on, and that is about technology solutions. We hit on it a little bit, but with the tools, talking about how we could use Figma, but also, different content management systems, and making sure those kind of are synced on the design side and content when we're actually creating products in the beginning. But wondering, like, later down the line when things are more or less approved and it's time to kind of transition to a build and a final product, what happens then? We start talking about authentication and actually dealing with real users on a real site. And John, I think you had a few things to say about that as far as technology goes.
I do have a few things to say about it. Yes. The topics of now, what I'm going to be saying is familiar to the point of exhaustion to half the people in the room, about the topics of authentication. Hey, do I just need to make this person click a checkbox and then I get to say, okay, I asked, here's your content. Or do I need to get them to sign in? How strongly do I need to get them to sign in? Do I need to get them to enter a regulatory number? Who do I have to look it up by? Those things have to be thought about on day zero, and they have to be well understood, and they have to be well understood by people probably that aren't the content creators, or the lawyers. Has to be understood by technologists so they can understand what the requirements are going to be. And chances are, if you're working in an organization of any size, there's already people whose whole entire full-time job is figuring out those things. But it's a question of partnering and finding out what your IT roadmap is to find out what kind of authorization is available now, what's going to be available 6 weeks from now, and what's going to be available 6 months from now, because that's going to have a very real impact on what you're going to be able to show before login, during login, and after login. But of course, again, there's no magic bullet. You have to do it very carefully to synchronize your own roadmap and then take in experience, because you can't necessarily count on those things that are 6 months in the roadmap of being present to have a plan B. So authentication and then also authorization. You know, we've all run up against issues where sometimes people can see things in certain contexts, but not other contexts. Every large platform out there, including the platforms that do CRM for pharma and the platforms that do CRM for financial services and the folks that do learning management, claim to have solved the problem of claim to have solved the problems of approvals. And I personally don't think that that is necessarily the case. Some of the biggest CRMs for the pharma space were built out of, some of the biggest content platforms for the pharma space came from a CRM background. They started life as a bunch of tools to allow a human who knew exactly what they can and can't do, go talk to another human, and then to select from the things that the human knows that they can show. There is a significant hurdle to teaching systems to be as flexible as that human representative. And by significant, I mean all caps with 3 exclamation points and underlines after it. That is a significant challenge. To me, I think that's one of the biggest things, is dealing with that sort of reality check / disappointment that comes 3/5 of the way through the project as you start understanding, okay, well, now that we know what we can say to various people, how can we rely on our platforms and our technologies so that only those people will be able to see it? And then you'll immediately start running into lots of, a myriad of little gotchas that say, well, sometimes people will be able to, and sometimes won't. And I want to go back and talk a little bit about one of the questions that came in from Martin. When you work with regulatories that are releasing their rules and regulations in pieces, how do you do with it? And the answer is very carefully, which is not to be too hand wavy about it, but it's to say, to try and build your approval pipeline, to try and build your development pipeline so that as few changes are catastrophic as possible. So it's not necessarily work super hard to get it right the first time. It's build things step by step so that a setback isn't necessarily a 5-mile setback. Keith, I saw you nodding about that. I'll throw it to you.
I'm in my mind, I'm thinking about one of the most challenging projects of all time was single sign-on. Implementing single sign-on for such a large company and how many entities that touches, making sure that that is all in place. Again, the kickoff is too late to start thinking about how to do single sign-on correctly. And so if people aren't even in that meeting, or everyone isn't aligned by then, I think you've already kind of set yourself up for failure as far as making that a successful feature on the site. So yeah, can't say enough how early that planning has to happen. Awesome.
So on the subject of technology, I think what our evidence was, there's no magic bullets. And that you have to get your requirements, just like you need to be friends with your lawyers from the beginning of the project. You also need to be friends with your IT people at the beginning of the project to find out what the roadmaps are going to be, because the software packages will disappoint you. Because even if they can theoretically do it, and of course they can do it, anything can be done with these packages given time and money. Some of the challenges are going to be very significant. You have to identify those early before they turn into showstoppers, requiring the rest of your team's effort to be workarounds from now until the end of the project.
For sure.
It's a challenge too when we're in the review process too, right? Like, it's less common to have content that will be the same for everyone that ever sees it than it is to have content that is highly variable. And so I think, from the perspective of a content strategist, we always have a secret other user that we have to serve, which is making content ingestible by machines. And so whether that's people who are working that from more of like an SEO perspective, or if we're talking about making sure that content can be ingested by an API so that it can be served on multiple platforms or in different ways. And there is so much education and training and talking that we have to do with these review boards to explain to them that there is, you know, a huge permutation and a huge possibility for what this content can look like, and have them feel safe and secure about the fact that this is going to look this way for this user, and it's this user is going to receive X, Y, and Z content. And so doing a lot of almost like knowledge sharing with the review teams about like, hey, this is what structured content is, and here's why it matters, and here's how that's going to affect the way that people experience this content, is definitely a similar challenge.
Colleen, I'm so glad you brought that up, because earlier on in the conversation, you talked about designing in the CMS. I know that's like, everyone has a different picture of what that is. Just wanted to like understand, like from your perspective, what that could mean and how that could like, I guess, happen on a project.
I mean, I guess there's two sides to that coin. The first being like, you can just build content in a CMS anytime you want, you know, and it's fun, and you should do it, and it's a great way to progress something from one end of the organization to the other, and help people use a design system who maybe don't have design competency. And then the second side of that coin is like, I do kind of serve the CMS too, and so it's important for me as a content strategist to give content some backbone and make it ingestible by the CMS and other CMSs. So
awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, I think now's the time for QA. We make sure we can answer all the questions that were coming in. So I'm going to hand it over to Phil.
First of all, I was just fully engaged this whole conversation. I'm not even sure how much I have to add to this conversation, except to be asked some of the questions that are in the Q&A channel. This has been a great conversation. I think the one thing that I like to say to folks, because folks always ask, you know, you're a former designer. I'm not a talented designer like anyone else here in this panel, because I haven't really touched any of our design tools in, you know, centuries, it seems. But they'll say, like, you know, what kind of books can I read to become a better designer? And I always, you know, there's like the design of everyday things and all that kind of stuff that people recommend immediately. But the first book that I always recommend is The Trusted Advisor, which is, you know, sort of talking to people. It's sort of consulting 101, how to become a trusted advisor and to your clients. And that's, I think, one of the great pieces of advice that kept rippling through everything that all of you were saying was like, I think Sun Quan said at some point, like, you have to establish that strong relationship with legal and regulatory folks. And it's all about building credibility and establishing that kind of relationship with them. So that's the only thing I'm going to add to the conversation before I start asking the questions is if you're looking for a good book to read and you're a designer or a technologist or a content strategist or someone who doesn't think of yourself as a consultant, pick up a good book like The Trusted Advisor on consulting skills and build those skills, because that will always make you a better designer. And that actually relates to the first question that was asked. It was asked by an anonymous attendee. So I'll ask it of all of you. Do you have any tips of your own for how you can help convince your client stakeholders to getting legal and regulatory folks involved earlier in the process? Like, how have you tackled this challenge yourselves or helped your clients tackle those challenges? I'm just gonna pick on Colleen because she's the first person in my window and see if she has any experience in that.
I'd love to defer to Sun Quan actually, because he is very successful in this. So
perfect.
Yeah, and you know what and I'm sure many of you might have thought of this, but I guess I can't think of a single stakeholder I've worked with, you know, in a pharma org that this isn't, or you wouldn't already be preaching to the choir about like, let's get them in early, or like let's talk to legal more often. But that's, you know, unless it's somebody who maybe just hasn't gone through it yet. If they haven't gone through their first design review with legal, maybe they might be thinking, oh, it'll be fine, or like it'll be straightforward. I think you know, reiterating any of the aspects of, you know, hey, how soon can we get this in front of legal? I'm concerned that this is going to throw off our deadline if we wait too long. Any of that kind of thing would be helpful. And I think if, you know, by early we're talking about like wireframes or concept level, then, depending on your position in the organization, it might be helpful to even offer to do some of the outreach on behalf of this client. Ideally, there's somebody who's connected enough that they can do that outreach themselves once you talk to them. But I think it's really, really about just like reminding them about anything else, right? You wouldn't just go and build just throw a design at a dev team and say, hey, just go ahead and build this, right? You take some time to ask ahead of time. So any of the questions you might ask to kind of overcome that objection from any other client or stakeholder that maybe is missing that fundamental idea that, we have to talk to all the people ahead of time so we don't waste a bunch of money. That usually tends to do the trick. But if it doesn't do the trick, then sometimes you can just kind of have to ask forgiveness and try and talk to that person yourself. But yeah, it does depend on the situation.
Yeah, that's great advice. Any additional advice, Keith? Have you?
Yeah, I think sometimes there's a notion that everything has to happen in a meeting. So, not always leaving the solutioning or, collaboration to happen within meetings. There's so many ways now with the new technologies to make that happen without syncing up our calendars.
Yeah, that's so great to think about that. I mean, how much easier our life is today when we can send a clickable prototype that allows you to comment on the prototype, like in Figma or Abstract or something like that, and get a legal review where they can do it, at their own leisure rather than in this overscheduled world that they live in. That's great advice.
I think also there's a big role for keeping the first 1 or 2 meetings easy, short, and demonstrating effort. Because I think if you really are buttoned down in your regulatory, like if you can demonstrate your understanding of what you think they're going to want to review, you can focus it for them. Here's what I'm going to be showing you, and here's what I need. Make it clear and not present them with too hard questions and sort of like build a feeling of trust. Like the lawyers, they'll definitely show up for the first meeting. They'll definitely show up for the second. But if you waste their time or yank them around in the first couple, they're going to be harder and harder to get a hold of. Say like, no, you know what? We'll do it at the end of the month. And then that's going to be a real high stakes meeting that is going to end in tears. And so I think, part of it is just like trying to work real hard not to waste their time and then to demonstrate that. And if you can get their buy-in, they're like, okay, sure, I'll look at your thing for 15 minutes because I know, you're coming to something straightforward.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of great advice. I'm sure we have a lot of other advice. I could talk for hours about the old world of when we used to review wireframes in like giant printed posters in a wall in a meeting room. The one thing I remember that worked really well was we would actually just hand the marker and say, can you mark it up for us? And now we have all kinds of other tools that they can do that with, but turning those sessions into collaborative sessions, the reviewers that we worked with found it very refreshing, where it wasn't, they were just giving you, dictates and pushing you on. They hate doing that themselves. So let's move on. We have a question by Martin. And I want to give him the opportunity to ask this himself. So Martin, you should get something that is allowing you to unmute if you want to, and you want to ask the question yourself. If you don't feel like it, I can take over. But I think you have to hit the mute button if you want to ask the question. All right, I think Martin's having a little bit of a challenge finding the unmute button, or it's not working for us. So I will ask the question. Hopefully you don't need any clarification from Martin on this. Do any of you have experience working with regulatory that is releasing their rules and regulations in pieces as they are created or updated? How do you decide when to build with what you have? How do you handle potential changes to your strategy if new rules are presented in the middle of development? Yeah, who hasn't experienced this? Raise your hand. You're aiming for a moving target. I don't know, does anybody have any advice on how to deal with this? John, you unmuted, so I'm going to make you the victim.
I did. And they talk about like, how do you handle potential changes to your strategy if new rules are presented in the middle of development? So I'll say, yeah, let's say you're actually building the thing at the point where those questions should have been answered. And now we're up at the tall end of the Bain curve where every change is $1 bazillion. You know, if we were talking about this in May, this would have been a $1 change, but it's September. This is $1 million change. And the only advice I get, how do you handle potential changes to that? Well, I cry a little bit, you know, and then I go for a run, and then I come back and, you know, do the best I can, which involves going to legal and say, oh, really? You know, and occasionally, sometimes legal says, not really. And you get lucky. Sometimes you say, okay, listen, how can we mitigate? What's the next step? You know, how can we do that? I think the only piece of advice I have, besides the sort of flip as best you can, is to have a really good pipeline for understanding what's a showstopper and what's not. Because so often it feels to me like 3/4 of the time is spent just deciding if something is a showstopper or not. And if you have a good process for separating the showstoppers from the non-showstoppers, you can sometimes keep most of your development momentum, because you know, like, well, what about this? Not a showstopper. What about this? Not a showstopper. What about this? We're going to handle that in February. That at least allows you to keep most of your developers on task, so that your feature development doesn't slow from 100 miles an hour to 0. It slows from 100 to 75. Obviously, it varies by case, but that's sort of like my only, you know, that's what I'm bringing to this.
Yeah,
Keith,
so
Colleen, Sanquan?
Yeah. Anyone else have any other advice on aiming for the moving target?
I think
make sure to get a timeline. Figure out if this is something that's a rule immediately, or if it's a rule that has a grace period, if it's just an update for how the legal team within the company is choosing to interpret new laws. You know, any of those nuances can help you to say, like, okay, all right, you know, this is going to help you sleep at night, but will the FDA come after us or shut us down for this? No? Okay. Then, you know, then that helps to build your case if you have to escalate to another, you know, person whose sort of budget is on the line. Yeah.
You know, I think, yeah, a lot of the dev work that we do is modular in that way. So a lot of times we can almost say deferring this for version 2 while we figure out what that new regulation means for that feature, and then bringing it back for that product. So I think there's definitely ways to separate it in that sense, although it may not be great for that first release, but you know, you can kind of promise everyone who's going to be using that product that it's coming on the way. You know, it's delayed by a certain you know, unforeseen circumstance there.
Yeah. Colleen, on the content side, I mean, especially in the world of pharma, you know, you see, like, one of the reasons why the rules are constantly changing is because the agreements between the client and the FDA are constantly changing. What you can say about the product until the, you know, the product, the PI is approved, or the or you know, a label change or anything like that. Have you experienced, you know, how content teams are reacting to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I mean, overall, I think, like, it's a bit of an art and science kind of scenario. Like, these reviews are more or less strict, but they're also a little bit subjective, right? We're talking about communication and how people read and learn things when we're talking about content, or how they ingest a certain type of media. And I think it's also really true of, like, financial institutions. Higher education goes through this a lot too, where the goalpost constantly shifts. And the best mediation to that is to have an unapologetic prioritization of your content operations, because there is only so much divination a content strategist can do for how content is going to need to change, or how the requirements of that are going to need to change. And so being really committed to developing sustainable content operations is the best way to support successful compliant content in the long run.
Yeah, it really is a big content operations game, and in the end, and just understanding it. Yeah, I can't add anything to that except say yes. Okay, let's go to the next question. I'm actually going to hit the next two questions because I feel like they are very closely related. They were both asked by someone anonymously. So hear these out if you can't see them on your screen, panelists. The first one is, if we're working on a co-collaboration model, at what stage do you think it's best to start pulling regulatory in? And then the second, which I believe is describing a co-collaboration model, our team works in Agile, but regulatory and compliance does not. So do you have any tips on how we can improve that and pull them into our Agile process? So if anyone here has sort of tried to merge the Agile teams with the non-Agile teams, John, again, you hit unmute, so I'm going to kind of hand it to you because that seems like a signal to me, but if you want to take it away, that'd be great.
Well, here's for me. Like at what stage do you think it's best to start pulling regulatory in? Step -2, step 0, talk to them before the kickoff meeting. Can you learn your lawyers' names? How many of them are there? Can you go to them and for 15 minutes and say, hey, what are the three previous teams? How did they annoy you? And how can I not do that thing? What's your biggest hobby horse? What's the thing you're most worried about? And just like talk to them and sort of like see if you can get on the page and figure out, because they will straight up tell you what they're going to be gunning for in the first meeting if you ask them.
So if I could just interject for one section like that, for 1 second, that's the core of the trusted advisor. Like, find out what their problems are and help them solve their problems, and you will forever be in their court. So thank you, John. Now keep going.
And then our team works in Agile, but regulatory/compliance doesn't. Any tips on how we can improve that and pull them into our Agile process? Yeah, sure. When you invite them to your elaboration meetings, don't call it elaboration meeting. Just say we're meeting every Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. Like they just think they're meeting you every 2 weeks. Or they just think they're meeting every week. Yeah, they don't need to know that they're attending a grooming session. That's a flip answer. But again, like if you can set up a sort of like steady cadence of conversations with people, I mean, hey, people over process. What's more Agile than that? Colleen, Keith, Sangkwan?
Yeah, and I think for once I might actually have something to talk about outside of pharma on this, but depending on, like, for example, I did work in telecom a little bit, and in that environment, it was there, the whole organization was Agile. There was a copywriting pass that happened, and most of the, regulatory stuff was around whether that copy passed muster, right? Whether the messaging passed muster. And in those cases, they were baked into essentially, it's almost like you have some level of Agile, and then it kicks off into this semi-waterfall process where, at least for a while, it's okay, this is going to be going through a gate of, okay, is this copy approved? Okay, now we're going to get it into the site. So, it's almost like if you're in a type of organization where you can structurally do that, then great, encourage those teams to do that. And for, in pharma, for me, the honest answer is that it still feels pretty waterfall, but at least we have monthly meetings that help to get it closer to saying like, okay, well, we're meeting often enough to get enough of this conversation done that we feel pretty comfortable that we've pushed the designs, as forward as much as we can with as much good legal counsel, and we can hit our stamp on there. But I know in pharma, I'm not really working particularly in an Agile way.
I mean, it's interesting, Sangkwan, because in my experience in pharma, telecom, and financial services, like the gatekeepers, those reviewers, they sort of are assuming Agile anyway. Like they're like, I'm not opening this gate until you make these changes. And so I think the mistake is that the Agile teams feel like, they're going to the regulatory teams right before launch, or what they perceive launch to be, as opposed to saying, hey, we're going to review this now. Let's not talk about the launch date. So we're going to get at a certain point where the team feels comfortable. We're at a certain point where we know it's going to look like this is how it's going to look and feel. We feel good about this. Let's go talk to the review committees. And when they say, when is this going to launch? You say, sometime in the future. Tell us what we have to change. They don't care what the launch date is. So they kind of act in an Agile way anyway, don't they? Colleen, you're kind of making expressions about that.
No. I was just shifting. It does remind me of a hard lesson that I had to learn, which is like, your review team is absolutely within their right to wholesale reject your ideas. Like that is literally their job, and they have no obligation to accept the solutions that you put forward. And so being like, and you might not be able to change the way that your organization interacts with your review board. That option may not be available to you immediately. And so, you know, when we think about like being good team members and good designers and good content designers, some of that is also just being open to other people's feedback and not pressuring them to meet your launch date. And that will foster a better culture of collaboration between you and the reviewers. And so just reminding yourself occasionally of that is something that I had to learn as well.
I guess I bring it up because like the example that I'm thinking about when I talk about this is, and I won't tell a long war story, but there was a product that was being launched. I was involved in designing one of the many microsites related to this product. And there was a certain kind of warning that had to have a very certain visual treatment to it that was dictated by interpretation of FDA regulations and things like that. And our microsite was the fifth of 10 microsites to be reviewed that had this warning on it. So they had reviewed 4, they looked at mine, and they said, hey, the warning does not have the visual treatment of the previous 4. So you've got to fix this warning, right? And they had already approved those, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and those teams had gone home. And when I pulled out the pages of the guidance that this group had published saying like the font size needs to be this, the color needs to be this, these hex values and all that kind of stuff, I was like, I'm compliant with the guidance that you provided. So if your guidance is wrong, then we'll fix it. But if your guidance is right, then the previous 4 sites that you're comparing me to are wrong. And they called those previous 4 product owners back and had them fix it. So like, that's pure agile. That's like, hey, we told you it was okay, but we know we weren't going to hit the publish button until Monday at 9 a.m. So you guys all have to come back tomorrow and fix these mistakes before we reapprove you. So they were even taking an agile approach to their approval. Like they had signed all the paperwork and then they retracted all their signatures. So I guess that's kind of why I take this position of like, they think agile without even knowing that they're thinking agile. And you just have to meet them where they are. All right, I'm sorry, I just wasted 3 minutes on a war story. Okay, Matt has a question. I'm going to find Matt and see if Matt wants to ask his question live. So Matt, if all things work correctly, you could unmute yourself and ask a question. Oh, wow, we're 2 for 2 here. Okay, well, I'm going to ask Matt's question. Does Think manage validation for transaction-based systems, or does the sponsor pharma participate in the process? One of the reasons why I unmuted Matt, because I wasn't exactly sure what he means by this, but if anybody has their interpretation of it, wants to answer it, please jump in.
For transactional-based systems, we will typically partner with an existing client's IT team in order to write the end-to-end tests, guaranteeing and recording that the result that was supposed to happen actually happened in a measurable way. And so we will typically not own that process. We will typically be collaborating with the regulatory folks inside our client's organization that's doing it. We will often participate in the language or the crafting of the language around what the end-to-end tests will be, sometimes even writing the end-to-end tests. Do the thing that, number of things should be incremented, and that occurs both in finance and other stuff. We will find that usually if there's 3 teams involved, one team always thinks that the test language is straightforward and the other 2 might be really confused about it. So we'll find that a lot of the times the hard work is to getting the other 2 teams to understand what output the first team is trying to get. Once all those 3 teams are in alignment, it's fairly straightforward to write a test to do it. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Matt says thank you in the chat. So I think that did answer the question. Good. Sorry about that, Matt. I don't know if we're having technical problems or or on our end or your end, but I hope that was helpful. Great. So, all right, the last question we have here is, how can my team create a more iterative process with compliance reviews? Any insights would help. So this is kind of related to the question 2 questions ago that we had, but has anyone had success in sort of working through a more iterative process with compliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there are simple answers to stuff like this, and one of them might be like, if you can create some sort of decision log for something that you've already met with your review boards on, and keep a log of that prior to opening up any prototypes or looking at any actual substance, to go through the decision log together. Maybe even create some sort of table of contents that has like skip to idea, like skip to links or something like that, where they will have full access to the full context of the thing, but maybe there's a focus mode or there's a slide deck that isolates the thing that you're talking about. And that way, if you need to back up into, you know, previous decisions that you've made, you have that ready. And then otherwise you're kind of just focusing on the very small thing that you're trying to update or enhance, while not barring access to previous decisions or to the fuller context of that thing.
That's great advice. And Keith and Sungkwan, I can't recall if you've developed prototypes like this, but I know in the past we've created prototypes where, you know, clickable prototypes in InVision or Figma, where there's sort of a table of contents, as opposed to just being on the homepage and saying, let's navigate through this like an end user. It's more of a compliance focused thing where it's like, hey, the last time we met, here's the things you told us to fix. And so here are our fixes for them. I don't know if you've had any experience with that or you want to talk about it.
Yeah, totally. I think, yeah, the context is good, as Colleen pointed out, of like, where do we come from? Why are we here looking at this thing? And then what do we have left to review? And having that like full end-to-end picture of, you know, knowing at least where it's headed, you know, without really swimming in a prototype and not knowing exactly where you are. I think that has been tremendously helpful.
Definitely. And I'd also try and model the way, like, do a little digging on how legal documents in the past have been submitted. For example, some organizations may still be on Microsoft Word, where you do just drop in screenshots and you have your annotations sort of on the side margins, or, you know, at least they're in something like PromoMats or Viva or something like that, where it's, you know, something like where you have an actual sort of PDF reader or document reader, logs of transcripts and comments and things like that. There's different ways that those reviews can happen. If it happens in something like Figma, that's fantastic, but pretty rare. So you often have to meet the legal reviewer where they are at, which is often some form of Microsoft Office product, or at least whatever might be the standard software they've been trained on within the organization. And if you're not using that software, modeling at least your design documentation or your handoff documentation to resemble that can also help bridge that understanding gap, so they kind of see what you're doing and know where to expect annotations and changes to be.
Excellent points, everyone. So John, did you have one last word, or because we're getting, I know we're going to lose some folks at 4:15, and I want to get to just sort of the wrap up, but if you have one more thing you wanted to say, that's fine.
I want Colleen to tell us about her budget for pushback.
Yes. So, you know, I talked a little bit about it before, but just trying to be a good partner and be open to feedback. You know, I had definitely gone through a couple of reviews where, you know, we weren't just like kind of meeting eye to eye about something, and it didn't seem like we were going to agree. And so learning to budget the number of rebuttals I would make against feedback is something that I try to practice now. So if I'm in a half an hour long review with a review board, I will allot myself something like three opportunities to respond to feedback, and then everything else I'm just going to accept. And so it really helps me prioritize the things that are important to the experience that I'm designing for, and also helps me be a little bit more open to the feedback that the review boards are providing.
That's great. I'm sure that contributes a lot to your sort of well-being during those meetings as well, where you feel like you don't have to fight every single piece.
Yeah.
That's great advice. Okay, well, we're at 4:14, so I kind of want to wrap it up. Thank you, everyone on the panel, just for great advice and providing all your expertise and all the preparation for this. A couple of notes for everyone who's still in attendance. We will be sending out a follow-up email with links to everything that the panelists referenced, as well as the recording. I believe we're also going to be able to pull down a transcript of it if you want to look through a transcript of this. We would love your feedback on this webinar. So as part of that email, you will get a 2-minute survey. It's also here at thinkpo.st. Share your feedback. And if you want to grab a virtual coffee with a panelist, please reach out. There's another link here at Grab a Virtual Coffee, and we can schedule time with you if you want to ask any kind of one-on-one questions or just have a chat or a discussion with one of our panelists. So it would be great to to meet with you then. As far as everything else is concerned, thank you all very much for attending. I see we still have 21 participants in attendance, so folks stuck around, which is great. It means we've been providing some great content. Please look forward to the emails that are coming in the inbox, and we hope to hear you or see you in another webinar soon. So thanks all the panelists, and thanks all the attendees. Have a great day.